A quarter or more of Canadians hold radical political views shaped by misinformation on social media. The fact they're wrong doesn't shake their conviction that they're correct one bit. This is a huge political problem because these folks are often the loudest and most disruptive in any conversation. How can Canada conduct meaningful national conversations about important issues like building pipelines or sky high housing costs if we can't even have a rational, evidence based discussion amongst ourselves? There are things we can do, but first we have to identify the folks who are the problem. Fortunately, that's easy. Frank Graves, longtime pollster and head of EKOS research, says a large majority are anti vaccine. Before we get to the interview with Frank, please consider supporting Energy Media's journalism by becoming a member of our YouTube channel. You'll find the URL to join in this video's YouTube description. We're going to talk today about research that you've been doing for a number of years now that correlates anti-vax attitudes amongst Canadians to their partisan support and also their support for misinformation, disinformation, and some very spurious kinds of positions on public issues. So maybe you could just give us an overview of your take on that.
Yeah, it's an interesting and complex area that's been evolving. But what we've seen more recently is that disinformation, belief in spurious things, not like, oh, the moonshot was faked in a desert in Las Vegas. I don't care about that. But, the vaccines have actually killed more people than lives saved, or that governments are intentionally concealing the real numbers of deaths. And of course, this is connected to all kinds of an expanding field of disinformation, such as issues like climate change, where a lot of people have gone, well, I don't know about that. I'm kind of skeptical, or maybe it would harm me in this part of the country. To no, it's just made up. It's fake news. And so this new feature, which is strongly linked to institutional mistrust, and this newer type of, well, not newer, this resurgence of a type of populism that we haven't seen in a long time, but which has been exploding in North America and in the advanced Western world for the last 10 years, has really produced intense levels of polarization and really collides with the public interest. The vaccine one is really interesting because you would think, and I would hazard a guess, that if I went back 10 years ago and looked at the relationship between vaccine take-up and partisanship, there would be a scant, if any, relationship. Now, just to give you a sense of the enormity of these connections, and I'm using those terms carefully, if I were to take the population of Canadians who had not vaccinated, which thankfully is relatively small in Canada, we did a really good job of adults, pretty well 90% got vaccinated in Canada, which is a reason we had considerably lower deaths than, say, in the United States per capita. But if I was just to focus in on that group, then and see how their vote preference is different, they're not somewhat different. They're not like twice as more likely to vote conservative. They're like 20 times more likely. And in fact, just to put this into graphic figures, if the election had been held simply with people who had not vaccinated, the Conservative Party of Canada would have won every seat in Parliament. And you got to think about that. I mean, that's an amazing statistic. Now, it carries over to those who stopped at 2 vaccines. Those people look more like the people who got no vaccines, particularly after mandates were reserved, but they also are enormously more favorably disposed to the Conservatives. So these links are new and I think disturbing.
I'm wondering if we can see that in the problems that Alberta Premier Danielle Smith is having, because she's been playing footsie with the separation movement, and there's a lot of support for that in her caucus. There's a lot of support in rural Alberta for that, some in the cities. And she says that her desire to change the referendum rules to make it easier for a referendum are designed to kind of be an outlet for that. And it seems like there's a strong correlation between her support of the people who would be anti-vax in Alberta and this separation issue. And it shows, I think, in a practical sense, how this pops up on the radar for politicians like Smith.
Yeah, no, there's the same dramatic connections, and it doesn't stop at support for separation. And I'd like to get into that one because it's a topic I have a lot of interest in and past knowledge on. But it also extends over, like, for example, if we're to pick, do you think the Freedom Convoy was something that was a good idea? Do you support it? And a not insignificant 25% of Canadians, it's not a fringe, say, yeah, it was a good thing. But those numbers are like 1% for those who voted for other than conservatives, and 52%, again, 25 times higher. So yes, support for separate country for Alberta, which, by the way, I'm going to tell you, as someone who's studied this for a long time, and in fact had the dubious honor of briefing the cabinet 2 days after the Quebec referendum, I have a lot of experience as to whether referenda are really something that's likely to happen, whether there was a Charlottetown Accord, the Quebec referendum. I've worked on those sorts of things. I can tell you, with the numbers that I look at in Alberta, the likelihood of a successful referenda under any of the current rules or any rules at all is pretty close to zero. Okay, now I'm not saying this isn't serious. It is. This is a troubling gap. I believe that this polarization that we've been talking about across this new type of this resurgent populism, disinformation, and is really probably more reflective of what the concerns are going in Alberta, which is more, it tends to be the epicenter of this. But those sorts of concerns and this type of polarization exists throughout the country. It's very strong in Ontario. And I think we kind of might be deceived into thinking that this problem is simply kind of an Alberta unique problem, because I think it's actually broader than that.
I want to bring up an anecdote here that maybe illustrates the issue. 10 years ago, I have a friend in Texas who I would not have said was a Trump supporter if you'd asked me 15 years ago, sort of the MAGA style culture politics. But in 2016, he very much was. And not and he said, I'm not anti-vax, but I have concerns with the number of vaccinations they give kids, yada. And now his attitude has changed. He's just anti-vax. And that was 10 years ago in the United States. And it's like the old 5-year rule, right? Whatever shows up in the US 5 years later will show up in Canada. Sure enough, right on cue, 2020, 2021, those attitudes where are they coming from? Like, who's pushing this?
Well, it's an important and interesting question. Some of this disinformation is emerging as a tool of statecraft coming from other countries, such as Russia, who are very good at it. It then tends to get amplified and reinforced by influencers and other interests in Canada and North America. The information disinformation ecosystem in Canada and the United States is seamless. It doesn't respect political geography. It's basically the same course. One of the key sources of this is YouTube. For males under 50, even under 55, most of them are on YouTube daily. Think about that. I was shocked when I saw these numbers several years ago. And this is algorithmically driven. If you like that, you like Jordan Peterson, well, what? Hey, take a little. We have a little Rogan. We have a little, Alex Jones, and all kinds of other things you can listen to. For example, Joe Rogan had a podcast about 2 months ago where he had Mel Gibson, well-known epidemiologist and virologist, telling listeners, and there's tens of millions of listeners, as Rogan nods, that he has 5 friends, or I think it was four or five friends, who had stage 4 cancer that was cured by ivermectin. The number of people who have been cured of stage 4 cancer by ivermectin is 0. The number of people who've been cured from COVID from ivermectin is essentially 0. So you may end up dying worm-free, but that's pretty well the only benefit of taking. But nonetheless, this is being promulgated along with all kinds of other sources and being received. Yeah, that's true, because guess what? The rates of consumption of mainstream media amongst the same group that are on the YouTube circuit is 0. They never look at it, and they say it's fake news.
This is of intense interest to me because, of course, Energy Media is involved in the Canadian pipeline debate. Should Alberta be allowed to build a pipeline to the West Coast and maybe even to the East Coast, North Coast, who knows? And I have been arguing lately because I've done the math, I've done the work, that in fact, outside of North America, the demand for Alberta's ultra heavy sour crude is marginal. It's almost non-existent in big markets like India. There's a marginal demand in China, and I get pushback from exactly the crowd you're talking about. And it's rabid, it's really rude in the comment section and so on. And no amount of data, no amount of expert opinion will sway it. And why is this group of the electorate, say 25%, as you noted, why is it so impervious to facts?
Well, in fact, on this number, it's even larger. The incidence of Canadians who now believe that climate change is a hoax. There's no relationship between human activities or carbon emissions, greenhouse gases, has nothing to do with climate change. It's climate change, but it's going on because of natural problems, and so on and so forth. That has burgeoned. We now have, I would say well over a third of Canadians that believe it's just totally made up. And they also believe, for example, that the proliferation of forest fires and floods is because of activist arsonists that are out in the woods doing this stuff, which is a variation on the Marjorie Taylor Greene Jewish space lasers. Not because these people didn't wake up in the morning and go, I think there's arsonists out in the woods setting fire. No, this was communicated to them through an disinformation network. And then it becomes, something that they believe is true. Well, if you believe that there's no relationship between carbon or human activities and climate change, then why wouldn't you support a pipeline? In this particular case, though, I think what we've seen is that this dovetails with a more legitimate concern that Canadians have about this, what they see as a relatively permanent rupture with the United States following Trump 2.0, in which case they're highly receptive to anything which says we can sunder those bonds, those economic bonds. And so the presentation of an East-West pipeline sounds like an attractive way. We can become an energy superpower. We don't have to export to the United States. But as you say, I think the level of reflection and literacy about the plausibility of this strategy is extremely low. But in this case, you end up with kind of a group that are there for, I would say, legitimate reasons, linked to another group that are there just because they say, there's absolutely no risk whatsoever.
I'm glad you brought up the idea of energy superpower. For American viewers, this is an idea that's been floated back in 2006 by former conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper. It's been around for 20 years, but it's been picked up of late because the oil and gas industry wants a pipeline from Alberta to the West Coast so it can tap Asian markets. Mark Carney, who is our new prime minister, PhD in economics, very famous global banker, has begun to pick up on this language. And his new energy minister, Tim Hodgson, is picking up on this language and talk about it all the time. And Frank, the question I have for you is once it gets into the mainstream like that, where the prime minister is talking about energy superpower, does that sort of turbocharge that, what might come from disinformation campaigns or industry funded campaigns and really put it into the public consciousness?
I think there's some fluidity here. And I think what we're seeing is most Canadians believe that the world order, which emerged after the Second World War, is over. It's been shattered. And so they're looking at all kinds of ways of redesigning our institutional arrangements, our place in the world. And so a lot of things are kind of falling into the orbit of, that might be a good idea. But there's a lot of internal contradictions and lack of clarity as to what that might be. So I think that'll get worked out in the coming months and we'll see. But the idea of an energy superpower, look, there's all kinds of really exciting energy superpower ideas that would involve things like retooling our hydroelectric corridor or which is a $2 trillion big national project that would have all kinds of returns and desperately needs to be done. I would put it myself, but I think it scores above, creating an east-west pipeline with what might be, by the time we get it working, a stranded asset with as you mentioned, a relatively picayune market in Europe or elsewhere. So I think there are some really legitimate, interesting ideas about an energy superpower involving all kinds of ingredients, which maybe includes, the fact that we do have, some of the oil and gas resources. But I think it's a much broader concept, which could be a tool of the future. And I think it enjoys right now a lot of resonance, but not a lot of clarity as to what exactly are the hard choices. Because you can't go spending $2 trillion on a hydroelectric corridor and go spend, $500 billion on a pipeline at the same time. You have to make some choices.
I would argue that, and in fact, I did in a video this weekend, that energy superpower has no definition. Nobody has ever defined it. No economist has ever defined it. The industry doesn't use it. It's a made up thing that kind of percolates in and out of the conversation. But if we can define it and agree on a definition, then it might have some usefulness in terms of mobilizing public support for things like a national power grid, which everyone agrees it would be in our best interest. But allowing politicians to use it the way Carney and Hodgson and Danielle Smith and others are using it basically is I would call it political manipulation. They're setting us up for something like a deal between Alberta and Ottawa around a pipeline. That's why they're using it, and they're tapping into this language and into these voters as you described them.
Yeah, I think the public writ large see the idea of an energy superpower as something far broader than something just based on, carbon-based resources. In fact, they would see the tilt leaning to other sort of post-carbon types of economy, post-carbon, types of energy. So I think that debate has not been fully enjoyed yet. I think it also lines up with Mr. Carney, the idea to make Canada an economic superpower, which I think is very attractive and a possible idea. And this could be one ingredient of it. But I think the idea of a government which is working with the private sector and other sectors to create large national projects, which will produce all kinds of not just good jobs, but careers for an under 35 population that is really angry and depressed about the fact that the middle class bargain that exists for their parents and grandparents is no longer on. They can't get a house. They're not doing better than their parents, and they think their kids are going to do worse than them. That's a very grim outlook. And I think there are things that we could do to disrupt that and produce a sense of not just opportunity and a better economic future, but rebuild a sense of Canada. And our sense of nationalism in Canada, unlike in the United States and Europe, has been crafted through a dialogue between citizens and the state. Whether it was railroads, the CBC, the Canada Health Act, the charter, all of these sorts of ideas are what have created this sense of Canada, which has atrophied dramatically, but has once again has been reawakened in a very dramatic fashion since Trump 2.0 appeared on the scene. So I would really like to see this idea of these national projects, whether it's an energy superpower focused on post-carbon or whatever, as an ingredient to rebuild the sense of an economic narrative of hope that we can aspire to, get a house, to retire in relative to security, to hand off to our kids a better future.
Let's bring this conversation full circle and get back to the unvaccinated and that sort of far right, their far right leaning and misinformation, disinformation. If we were going to have this economic narrative that is a nation building exercise and binds Canadians together again, like the conversations we've had about the issues that you just mentioned, what role does this group, this populist group, bound by all this, disinformation and like anti-vax, do they prevent that conversation from having? Do they make it more difficult? What's your take?
If we don't interrupt the current trajectory, I think it's going to make it extraordinarily difficult to make progress on these key areas of national interest. But I would point out that there are things that can be done. Those who fall into the thrall of disinformation, particularly those who are moderately disinformed, there's plasticity. There is ability to reach those people. There's ability to have quiet, respectful conversations in ways that will take them out of that state. There is a radicalized group at the top, probably about 7% of Canadians, as we would figure it, who are not reachable. They're entrenched. But there's a lot of possibilities for reaching those other groups. Go back. I, as a member of the Federal Vaccine Confidence Task Force, I know that people forget this, but we went from about 4% in Canada masking to 90% in the first year of COVID. Guess what? There were no mandates. None. People just said, that's a pretty good idea, as a precautionary principle. Similarly, the receptivity to vaccines, initially, it was like more, FOMO, fear of missing out. Everybody wanted to get a vaccine, and it was very effective. So these things have crept in post hoc, but that means that they aren't things which are set in granite. They can be changed. But we need a coordinated, effective strategy to address disinformation and polarization in this country. There's other countries that are moving far more quickly on these. Australia has banned social media for kids under 16. Guess what? It's extraordinarily toxic, probably worse than smoking cigarettes or drinking beer. And yet, we have no strategies for dealing with online harm. Targeted disinformation that has no other purpose than to foment hate and revenge. All these sorts of things are things where there are options for dealing with it. And there are people working on it, but we got to move pretty damn quickly because we're just basically treading water now.
Okay, Frank. Let's say that we agree on the fact that there needs to be something done about misinformation, disinformation, before this group that is a problem now becomes a bigger problem down the road. What do we do, and who does it?
Well, I mean, there's a range of ideas out there. I mentioned what Australia was doing. The European Digital Act is far more muscular than what we're working with. But we have countries like Finland, which have basically inoculated themselves against disinformation. They start with kids in kindergarten and then go through showing them TikTok videos and instructing them in critical reasoning skills that inoculate them from this. There are a whole range of things. There's some evidence that AI-generated models helping people disentangle information from disinformation are extremely effective. There are things we could do. We could charge our national broadcaster, the CBC, with a mission to expand its role to deal with disinformation. I think there's lots of things that can be done, but one of the key problems we have now is that the path to political power for the new forms of populism is paved with disinformation. So they will scream bloody murder. And, it's one thing to say, look, we can have differences of values, we can have differences of opinion, but we can't all have our own facts. And particularly when those facts collide with the public interest, as they do. Like measles was wiped out. What are we going to have next? Polio, a little bit of, diphtheria back. I mean, come on. These things are completely avoidable. And it could get much worse if we had another, COVID-like pandemic, which is not something we can rule out.
Yeah, I see this all the time in the oil and gas conversation, because there'll be, like the Alberta Premier Danielle Smith and their Energy Minister Brian Jean will claim over and over again that oil and gas emissions are falling. Well, they're not falling. The emissions intensity per barrel are falling, but if you produce more of something, it overwhelms the reductions in intensity, and you get absolute emissions growing and growing and growing, which is what's happening in Alberta. And it's really difficult to combat that misinformation when, in fact, it's like the premier of a province that's promulgating it. And she does this on, she's like a mini Trump. And it's, as somebody who fact checks her all the time, I can say that with some confidence. And
Yeah.
she's not alone in Canada. I mean, we have other politicians, we have other political leaders who regularly traffic in disinformation.
Yeah, I know that the public are strongly supportive of removing targeted disinformation from political campaigns. And that transcends partisanship. There is broad support for that. And there are ways that can be done. I know that, for example, in the United States, the FCC precluded the use of AI-generated robocalls in political campaigns. There are things that can be done. If we look at the level of oversight that's provided for traditional media, television, radio, newspapers by the CRTC, nothing, you don't see this stuff in there. There's some of it, but it's a picayune fraction compared to what you see on the toxic swamp of social media now. So we need to, I think, have regulatory officials which takes us out of the world of politics and puts it into the realm of places like the CRTC, and has, kind of guidelines that enforce removing online harm, removing disinformation, because it's having an incredibly toxic impact. It's corroding our society, it's polarizing us, and it's a type of polarization which is particularly insidious, because it's not just, I don't agree with you on climate change. If you have that position, I don't like you. This is what we call affective polarization. I don't want you living on my street. I don't want you dating my daughter. And this is something which is relatively new and insidious. So we have to figure this out pretty damn quickly.
Well, Frank, thank you very much. This has been very enlightening, and as all of our conversations are, glad to see you, back, and we'll do this again in the near future.
Always fun to talk with you. If a little frightening. Okay.